The funeral director's clipboard clattered to the frozen ground, his eyes locked on the massive grizzly bear that had just emerged from the Montana tree line. 1,000 pounds of wild muscle moved through the gathered mourners with impossible calm, each heavy paw step crunching through October leaves as panicked guests dove behind headstones and scrambled toward their cars. This wasn't supposed to happen at Dr. William Henderson's funeral. Eleanor Henderson's weathered hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp that turned heads even amid the chaos. "Moses," she whispered. The name carried on wind that seemed to hold its breath. Her brother Bill lay in that pine casket just 20 feet from where the bear now stood, massive head lowered in what could only be described as reverence. "Everyone stay calm," Sheriff Morrison barked, though his own voice cracked with uncertainty. His hand hovered over his sidearm, knowing that one wrong move could turn a funeral into a massacre. But what happened next would reveal a secret buried for 20 years, and change everything they thought they knew about the man they'd come to mourn. Leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 days before that grizzly bear would change everything, Dr. William Bill Henderson sat on the wraparound porch of his struggling Montana ranch, watching the sun paint the Glacier National Park peaks in shades of amber and gold. At 72, his weathered hands still steady enough to suture a wound, Bill had become something of a legend in these parts, though not always the kind that made folks comfortable at Sunday dinner. The Henderson Ranch sprawled across 500 acres of prime wilderness border, where civilization met the untamed heart of grizzly country. Bill's late wife Martha used to joke that he'd married the mountains first and her second, but she'd said it with the kind of smile that meant she understood. 10 years since her passing, and Bill still caught himself setting 2 coffee cups on the kitchen counter each morning. The ranch had seen better days. Fences sagged like old men's shoulders, the barn roof leaked worse each winter, and the bank notices kept coming with increasing urgency. Bill's veterinary practice had dwindled to mostly wildlife calls, the kind that paid in gratitude rather than cash. His neighbors whispered he cared more about injured coyotes than his own financial survival, and they weren't entirely wrong. Sarah Mitchell pulled her rental car up the gravel drive that afternoon, her heart sinking at the sight of peeling paint and overgrown pastures. At 45, Denver's most sought-after cardiac surgeon had her father's stubborn streak and her mother's practical sense, though she'd never known Martha personally. Bill had taken Sarah in when she was 15, a rebellious teenager whose own parents had given up trying to manage her wild spirit and academic brilliance. "You look tired, Dad," Sarah said, settling beside him on the porch swing that creaked like old bones. "Just thinking too much," Bill replied, though the deep lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and chest pains he wouldn't admit to. "Ranch isn't what it used to be." Sarah had been secretly paying his medical bills for 5 years, funneling money through a maze of accounts so his pride wouldn't catch wind of it. She studied his profile, the same strong jaw that had faced down angry ranchers, the same gentle eyes that had coaxed trust from wounded animals. "Maybe it's time to consider selling, Dad. You could come live in Denver, closer to proper medical care." Bill's laugh carried no humor. "This land has been in our family for 3 generations, sweetheart. Besides, who'd look after the strays?" As if summoned by his words, a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its wing clearly favoring one side. Bill squinted up at it with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades reading animal body language. "That one's hurt," he murmured, already calculating how he might coax it down for treatment. Sarah followed his gaze, understanding for the millionth time why her father would never leave this place. The mountains had claimed him long ago, and some claims ran deeper than money, deeper than practicality, deeper than the fear that was already growing in her chest about what his next medical crisis might bring. The emergency call came at dawn on a Tuesday that would change everything. Bill's ancient rotary phone jangled him awake, the sound cutting through the mountain silence like a chainsaw through prayer. On the other end, Tommy Clearwater's voice shook with the kind of panic that made seasoned ranchers forget their pride. "Doc Henderson, you gotta come quick. Found a bear cub up by Miller's Creek, caught bad in one of them old snares. Mama's dead beside her, been shot. This little one's in rough shape." Bill's chest tightened, not just from the familiar squeeze of angina, but from the image Tommy painted. Illegal snares meant poachers, and dead mother bears meant orphaned cubs rarely survived the wilderness alone. He pressed his palm against his sternum, willing the pain to subside. "How bad is the cub hurt?" "Legs mangled pretty good, Doc. Wire cut deep. She's maybe 4 months old, scared out of her mind." "I didn't dare get too close, but she ain't moved much in the hour I've been watching." Bill glanced at his pill bottle on the nightstand, the one Sarah didn't know he'd been rationing because the prescriptions cost more than his monthly grocery budget. 2 pills left. He dry swallowed one and saved the other for emergencies. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. "Doc, maybe you should call Fish and Game instead. This ain't exactly legal what you do." "Some things can't wait for paperwork, Tommy." Bill's truck coughed to life like a consumptive old man, the engine he'd been meaning to rebuild for 3 years, finally showing its age. As he drove the winding mountain road toward Miller's Creek, his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Dad, when's your next cardiology appointment? The Denver clinic has openings next week." He ignored it. Sarah worried enough without knowing about the chest pains that came more frequently now, or the dizzy spells that sometimes left him gripping door frames until the world stopped spinning. She'd already sacrificed too much of her own life taking care of him, though she thought he didn't know about the anonymous payments keeping his medical insurance current. The scene at Miller's Creek broke his heart in the way only decades of wildlife rescue could. The mother bear lay sprawled beside the creek, her massive form reduced to stillness by a poacher's rifle. Nearby, a cub no bigger than a medium dog struggled weakly against the wire snare that had caught her left hind leg. Blood matted her dark fur, and her small cries sounded disturbingly human. "Jesus," Bill whispered, kneeling beside the trap with his veterinary kit. The wire had cut to bone. Without immediate surgery, infection would claim her within days. As he worked to free the cub, his chest began its familiar squeeze. "Not now," he pleaded silently. "This baby needs help." He fumbled for his remaining pill, chewing it quickly as sweat beaded on his forehead despite the October chill. The cub, exhausted from struggling, went limp in his arms as he cut the final wire. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Bill cradled her against his chest, feeling the rapid drumbeat of her terrified heart against his own struggling one. "Easy, little girl. Papa's got you now." The words came automatically, the same ones he'd whispered to every injured animal he'd ever treated, the same lullaby he'd once sung to his own children during nightmares. But as he carried the cub toward his truck, memories crashed over him like a cold wave. 20 years ago, he'd found another bear cub in similar circumstances. That one had grown into Old Moses, the massive grizzly that locals claimed was the smartest bear in Montana. Moses had disappeared into the wilderness after Bill's release, but rangers occasionally reported sightings of an unusually large male with a distinctive notched ear, Bill's surgical mark. This cub felt the same in his arms, the same fierce determination to survive, the same way of going still when she sensed safety. Bill's chest pain intensified as emotion and physical stress compounded, but he pushed through it. Some things mattered more than his own comfort. Back at the ranch, Bill set up the makeshift surgical area in his barn, the same space where he'd performed hundreds of procedures over the decades. As he prepped the anesthesia, his hands shook, whether from the heart medication or the weight of what he was attempting. He couldn't tell. The surgery took 3 hours. Cleaning the wound, removing damaged tissue, setting the small bones with pins that cost more than his monthly electric bill. As he worked, Bill found himself talking to the unconscious cub the way he'd once talked his own children through difficult moments. "Your mama loved you something fierce, little one. That's why she stayed between you and danger, even when it cost her everything. That's what parents do. We stand between our babies and the world's sharp edges, even when we know it might break us." When it was over, the cub slept peacefully in a recovery pen Bill had fashioned from hay bales and chicken wire. Her leg was stabilized, her breathing steady. She'd live if he could nurse her through the critical first weeks. Bill slumped against the barn wall, his chest feeling like someone had wrapped barbed wire around his heart and pulled tight. This time, the pain didn't ease. Jake Morrison's Forest Service truck kicked up a dust cloud as it wound up the familiar gravel drive to the Henderson Ranch. 15 years since he'd last set foot on this property, and every landmark hit him like a physical blow. The crooked mailbox he'd backed into with his first car, the oak tree where his father had built him a tire swing, the barn where they'd once worked side by side until everything went to hell. At 38, Jake had inherited his father's stubborn jaw and his mother's quick temper, a combination that had served him poorly in most of life's important moments. His recent divorce had left him fighting for weekend visits with 8-year-old Tommy, and the legal bills were drowning him faster than he could bail. The ranch represented his only lifeline, if he could convince the old man to sell. Bill emerged from the barn as Jake's truck door slammed shut, wiping blood-stained hands on a towel. For a moment, father and son simply stared at each other across a chasm that had taken 15 years to carve. Bill looked older, frailer than Jake remembered, but his eyes still held that same stubborn fire that had driven them apart. "Jake." Bill's voice carried no warmth, no surprise, just acknowledgement. "Dad?" The word felt rusty in Jake's mouth. "Heard you were having some money troubles." Bill's laugh held no humor. "News travels fast in small towns. You here to gloat or to help?" "Neither. I'm here to talk sense." Jake gestured at the sagging fence posts, the peeling barn paint. "This place is falling apart. You're 72 years old with a heart condition, trying to run a ranch that's bleeding money. It's time to be practical." "Practical." Bill repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "Your mother used to say that too, right before she'd remind me that some things matter more than money." "Mom's been dead 10 years, Dad." "And practicality might have saved this place if you'd listened to her more often." Jake's voice rose despite his intentions to stay calm. "Instead, you spent every dollar we had on wounded animals while your own family struggled." The accusation hung between them like smoke from a grass fire, acrid and choking. Bill's face went pale, one hand pressing against his chest in a gesture Jake didn't recognize. "You think that's what happened?" Bill's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "You think I chose animals over family? I think you made your priorities clear the night I left." Jake's old anger flared hot and immediate. "When I needed you most, you were more worried about some damn bear than your own son." Bill staggered slightly, catching himself against the barn door. The towel in his hands was stained with more than just the cub's blood. His own face had gone gray, sweat beading on his forehead despite the October chill. "Dad?" Jake's anger evaporated into concern. "You okay?" "Fine," Bill gasped, though clearly he wasn't. "Just tired. When's the last time you saw a doctor?" "Don't need doctoring. Need people to stop trying to fix what ain't broken." But Bill's breathing was labored, his left hand clutching his chest like he was trying to hold his heart inside his rib cage. Jake moved closer, his Forest Service training kicking in. He'd seen enough medical emergencies in the backcountry to recognize the signs of cardiac distress. "Dad, we need to get you to a hospital." "No hospitals." Bill's voice carried the finality of a judge's gavel. Got responsibilities here. That cub in there won't make it without round-the-clock care. Jesus Christ, Dad, you're having a heart attack and you're worried about a bear? Bill's eyes blazed with the fire Jake remembered from childhood, the look that had once made him believe his father could fix anything, protect anyone. That cub's mama died protecting her. Least I can do is honor that sacrifice. And what about honoring your own son? The words hit Bill like a physical blow. His knees buckled and Jake caught him as he fell, feeling how thin his father had become, how fragile beneath the stubborn exterior. In that moment, holding his dying father in his arms, Jake Morrison realized he'd come home to settle old scores and instead might be about to lose the only chance he'd ever have to understand them. The ambulance ride to Kalispell Regional Medical Center took 23 minutes that felt like 23 hours. Jake sat beside his father's gurney, watching monitors spike and dip while paramedic Jenny Walsh, no relation to the cardiac surgeon, worked with practiced efficiency to keep Bill stable. His father drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling about the bear cub and something called the safe, and letters Jake needs to read. What letters, Dad? Jake leaned closer, but Bill's eyes had rolled back again, his breathing shallow and mechanical. Sarah's flight from Denver landed just as they wheeled Bill into the cardiac unit. She burst through the hospital doors, still wearing her surgical scrubs from an emergency procedure she'd abandoned mid-operation when Jake's call came through. The siblings hadn't seen each other in 3 years, their relationship strained by distance and the weight of their father's expectations. How is he? Sarah's medical training warred with her terror as a daughter. Massive myocardial infarction, Dr. Patricia Reynolds explained, using the clinical terms that made everything sound manageable. We've got him stabilized, but the damage is extensive. His heart muscle shows signs of previous silent attacks. This has been building for months. Sarah's face went white. She'd been sending money for his medical care, but clearly her father had been skipping appointments, rationing medications, hiding the true extent of his condition. Can you operate? At his age, with this much damage, surgery would be extremely high risk. We're talking about a man who's been ignoring serious cardiac symptoms for what looks like years. Jake felt the familiar surge of anger, not at the doctors but at his father's stubborn pride. Of course he ignored it. God forbid he admit weakness or ask for help. He was trying to protect us, Sarah said quietly, though her voice carried its own frustration. You know how he is. He'd rather suffer in silence than burden his children. His children, Jake repeated bitterly. One of whom he drove away 15 years ago, and the other who's been supporting him from a distance like some kind of guilty stranger. They sat in the cardiac ICU waiting room, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of industrial cleaning solutions and the distant sounds of medical equipment. Other families huddled in similar configurations of grief and hope, but Jake felt isolated even from Sarah's presence. Too much time had passed. Too many words had been left unsaid. Bill coded twice during the night. Each time, the medical team rushed in with controlled urgency while Jake and Sarah were pushed into the hallway to wait. Each time, they brought him back, but the intervals between crises grew shorter. At dawn, Dr. Reynolds emerged with the expression Jake had learned to dread during his own medical emergencies in the Forest Service. We've done everything we can. His heart, it's just too damaged. I'm sorry. Sarah crumpled into a plastic chair, her professional composure finally cracking. She'd saved hundreds of hearts during her career, but couldn't save the one that mattered most. Jake stood frozen, staring through the ICU window at the man who'd raised him, fought with him, loved him despite everything. Can we see him? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Of course. Take as much time as you need. Bill looked smaller in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines that had kept him alive long enough for his children to say goodbye. His weathered hands, which had sutured countless wounds and gentled frightened animals, lay still on the white blanket. Jake approached the bed hesitantly, as if his father might wake up and resume their argument from the day before. "I never meant for it to end like this," Jake said to the unconscious figure. "I came back to, hell, I don't know what I came back for. Money, maybe, closure, but not this." Sarah took their father's hand, noting how thin it had become. "He talked about you constantly, you know. Every time I called, he'd ask if I'd heard from you. He kept your room exactly the same, like he was waiting for you to come home. He had a funny way of showing it. Maybe because he didn't know how to show it any other way." Sarah's tears fell onto the hospital blanket. "He wasn't perfect, Jake, but he loved us the only way he knew how." Bill's eyes fluttered open one final time, focusing with effort on his children's faces. His lips moved, forming words that came out as barely a whisper. "Safe. In the barn. Letters. You need to know." "What letters, Dad?" Jake leaned closer, but his father's breathing had changed, becoming irregular and labored. "Jake." Bill's voice was fading. "The accident wasn't your fault. I never wanted you to carry—" The words dissolved into silence as Bill's heart monitor flatlined. Dr. Reynolds and her team rushed in, but Jake knew it was over. The stubborn, complicated, loving man who'd shaped his childhood and haunted his adult life was gone, taking his secrets with him. The funeral arrangements fell to Sarah, since Jake remained too stunned to make practical decisions. Bill had left specific instructions with his lawyer: burial at the ranch, simple ceremony, no embalming chemicals that might contaminate the groundwater. Even in death, he was thinking about the wildlife that depended on the land. Eleanor Henderson arrived from town 2 days later, her Alzheimer's symptoms making her seem older than her 68 years. But when she saw Jake, her eyes cleared with surprising sharpness. "Billy's boy," she said, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "You look just like him at your age." Before the weight of all those secrets bent his shoulders. "What secrets, Aunt Ellie?" Eleanor's gaze grew distant again, as if she was looking at something only she could see. "The night you left, that poor bear cub. Billy never told you the truth about what really happened, did he?" Jake's chest tightened. His aunt often spoke in riddles now, her memory mixing past and present in confusing ways. But something in her tone suggested this wasn't random confusion. "What truth?" "Some burdens are too heavy for one person to carry," Eleanor murmured. "But Billy, he'd rather break his own back than let his children feel the weight." Before Jake could press for more details, Eleanor's attention shifted to the window, where she claimed to see bears gathering in the tree line. Sarah attributed it to her condition, but Jake found himself scanning the forest anyway, remembering his father's lifetime of stories about the wildlife that called this land home. The funeral was set for Thursday afternoon, giving people time to travel from neighboring ranches and towns. Bill had been a controversial figure in some circles. His willingness to treat dangerous predators had earned him enemies among ranchers who preferred simpler solutions to wildlife conflicts. But he'd also saved enough domestic animals over the years to earn grudging respect from most of the community. Wednesday night, Jake finally worked up the courage to search the barn for his father's safe. He found it hidden behind a false wall in the tack room, the combination scrawled on a piece of paper tucked inside Bill's old veterinary journal. Inside the safe, he discovered 3 sealed envelopes, one addressed to Sarah, one to Eleanor, and one to himself. Jake's hands shook as he tore open his letter. His father's careful handwriting filled 2 pages, but one paragraph made him sink onto a hay bale as his legs gave out. "Son, I know you left believing I chose animals over family, but the truth is more complicated than you know. The night you had that accident with the ATV, when you hit that bear cub, You were drunk and scared and 23 years old. You called me crying, terrified you'd ruined your life. I made a choice that night to take the blame, to report it as a wildlife management incident and pay the fines myself. I never wanted you to carry the guilt of that little one's death, even though it meant you'd carry the guilt of resenting me instead." Jake read the paragraph 3 times before the words penetrated. The accident. The night that had driven the final wedge between them. He'd been so drunk he barely remembered the details, only the sick thud of impact and the small body lying motionless beside his overturned ATV. His father had arrived within minutes of Jake's panicked phone call, taken one look at the scene and told him to go home and sleep it off. The next morning, Bill had reported finding a bear cub killed by a vehicle on ranch property. He'd paid the substantial fines without complaint, endured the criticism from neighbors who called him careless with wildlife safety. Jake had watched his father's reputation suffer and felt nothing but resentment that even in crisis, the old man seemed to care more about animals than family. Now, 15 years too late, Jake understood the magnitude of his father's sacrifice. Thursday afternoon arrived gray and bitter, with October winds that cut through funeral clothes and rattled the bare aspen branches like old bones. The Henderson Ranch had never hosted so many people at once. Neighbors who'd feuded with Bill for decades stood beside wildlife biologists who'd driven from 3 states away to pay their respects. The gathering felt tense, divided between those who saw Bill as a hero and those who'd always considered him a dangerous fool. Jake stood beside his father's simple pine casket, still reeling from the previous night's revelation. Sarah had read her own letter that morning, tears streaming down her face as she learned the truth about her adoption, how Bill had found her abandoned at a Kalispell hospital, born with a complex heart defect that her teenage mother couldn't afford to treat. He'd spent his life savings on her surgery, then covered her medical needs for years while telling everyone she was a family friend's daughter he'd taken in. Eleanor had insisted on reading her letter aloud to both siblings. Her Alzheimer's seemed to retreat in the face of grief, leaving her lucid and sharp-eyed as she revealed their father's final secret. He'd been diagnosed with congestive heart failure 6 months earlier, given 12 months to live at best. He'd planned to tell them both at Christmas, after Jake's custody battle was settled and Sarah's surgical fellowship was complete. "He was going to bring you both home," Eleanor had whispered. "Make peace before it was too late." Now, as Jake watched neighbors file past the casket, he felt the weight of 15 lost years pressing against his chest. Conversations that would never happen. Apologies that would remain unspoken. His father had died believing his son hated him when the truth was far more complicated. "Quite a turnout," Sarah murmured, moving to stand beside him. She'd flown back from Denver that morning with red-rimmed eyes and a leave of absence from the hospital. "I never realized how many lives he'd touched. Most of them animal lives," grumbled Bobby Steinberg from behind them. Bill's brother-in-law had arrived with barely concealed hostility, his presence a reminder of old wounds and bitter disagreements. "Your father's bleeding heart got my grandson killed, you know. Made bears too comfortable around humans." Jake turned slowly, his Forest Service training helping him recognize the signs of a man looking for a fight. Bobby's grandson had died in a bear attack 3 years earlier, a tragedy that had hardened an already difficult man into something approaching cruel. "That's quite an accusation, Bobby." "It's the truth," Bobby shot back, his voice carrying across the funeral gathering. "Bill Henderson spent 40 years teaching predators they had nothing to fear from humans. Treating their injuries, feeding their cubs, making them think we were allies instead of the enemy they should respect." Several mourners turned at the raised voices. The division Jake had sensed earlier was crystallizing into open conflict. On one side stood the ranchers and practical locals who'd always questioned Bill's methods. On the other gathered the wildlife advocates, researchers, and younger generation who saw his work as pioneering conservation. "My father saved more animals than he ever endangered," Sarah said quietly, but her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to life and death decisions. "And he never put human safety at risk." "Tell that to my daughter." Bobby's voice cracked with old grief. "Tell that to a mother who'll never see her boy grow up because your father convinced everyone that grizzlies were just misunderstood teddy bears." The argument might have escalated further, but Eleanor Henderson stepped forward with the surprising authority that old age sometimes brings. "Bobby Steinberg, you're grieving and you're angry, but you're also wrong. That bear that killed little Marcus wasn't one of Billy's rescues. State biologists confirmed it was a wild male defending territory." "Doesn't matter," Bobby insisted, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "Henderson's philosophy—" "His philosophy," Eleanor interrupted, "was that every life has value, human and animal both. You're entitled to your grief, but you're not entitled to poison his memory with lies." The tension in the crowd was palpable now, divided loyalties creating invisible battle lines among the mourners. Jake found himself caught in the middle, understanding both perspectives. His father's work had indeed made local wildlife less fearful of humans, but that had also allowed for medical treatment that had saved dozens of animals over the years. Dr. Patricia Vance, a wildlife biologist from the University of Montana, stepped forward to address the growing conflict. "I've studied Dr. Henderson's treatment records for my research. In 40 years of practice, not one animal he treated and released was ever involved in a human conflict incident. His protocols were meticulous, his follow-up legendary." "Statistics don't bring back the dead," Bobby muttered, but some of the fight had gone out of him. The argument was interrupted by a sound that made every head turn toward the tree line, a deep, resonant call that seemed to echo off the mountain faces. Not quite a roar, not quite a moan, but something that spoke of wild spaces and ancient sorrows. "What the hell was that?" someone whispered. Jake's Forest Service experience told him exactly what it was. Though his rational mind rejected the possibility, grizzly bears were preparing for winter denning. They should be deep in the backcountry, focused on building fat reserves, not approaching human settlements. Eleanor's face had gone pale, but her eyes held a strange light. "They're coming," she said softly. "Billy always said they'd know when it was time to say goodbye." "That's impossible," Dr. Vance said, though her voice carried uncertainty. "Bear behavior doesn't—" Another call, closer this time, cut off her explanation. Then another, from a different direction. The mourners began to shift nervously, some moving toward their vehicles while others strained to see into the forest shadows. "Everyone needs to get to their cars," Jake announced, his training taking over. "Now, slowly and calmly, but now." But even as he spoke, the first bear emerged from the aspens. Massive and dark, moving with the deliberate pace of an animal that had decided humans posed no threat. The crowd froze, caught between the instinct to run and the hypnotic fascination of witnessing something unprecedented. "Nobody move," Jake commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd dealt with wildlife emergencies. "No sudden movements, no loud noises. Back away slowly toward the vehicles." The bear, a grizzly male that had to weigh close to 600 pounds, paid no attention to the human crowd. His focus was entirely on the pine casket that held Bill Henderson's body. As the mourners watched in stunned silence, the massive animal approached the funeral setup with what could only be described as reverence. "Jesus Christ," Bobby whispered. That's not natural." But Eleanor Henderson smiled through her tears. "That's Moses," she said with quiet certainty. "Billy saved him 20 years ago. Cut him free from a poacher's snare, nursed him back to health. He's come to say goodbye." The bear Jake's father had called Old Moses stopped beside the casket, his massive head lowering in what looked remarkably like a bow. For several heartbeats, predator and mourners existed in perfect, impossible stillness. Then a second bear appeared from the forest, and a third. "We need to leave," Dr. Vance said urgently. "This is completely unprecedented behavior. We have no idea what they're planning." But Jake found himself stepping forward instead of back, drawn by something he couldn't name. The lead bear, Moses, turned those ancient, intelligent eyes toward him, and for a moment man and beast regarded each other across an evolutionary gulf that suddenly seemed much narrower than Jake had ever imagined. "You knew him, didn't you?" Jake said softly. "You knew my father." Moses rumbled deep in his chest, a sound that was neither threatening nor submissive. Recognition, perhaps. Or grief, though Jake's rational mind rejected the possibility that wild animals could mourn. Sarah moved to stand beside her brother, her medical training warring with her emotions. "This is impossible," she whispered. "Animals don't. They can't. Your father always said they understood more than we gave them credit for," Eleanor said, her Alzheimer's clarity holding steady in this moment of crisis. "He said Moses was the smartest bear he'd ever worked with, smart enough to remember kindness." The third bear, smaller than the other two, approached the casket and did something that made the entire crowd gasp. She reached into her mouth and carefully placed something on the pine wood, a small metal object that glinted in the gray afternoon light. Jake moved closer, his heart pounding. There, on his father's casket, lay a medical alert bracelet, the one Bill had worn for years, the one that had gone missing the morning he'd collapsed in the barn. "How?" Sarah's voice trailed off into stunned silence. Moses rumbled again, a sound that carried across the ranch like distant thunder. Then, with the same deliberate dignity with which they'd arrived, the three bears turned and melted back into the forest, leaving behind a crowd of mourners who would never quite believe what they'd witnessed. In the silence that followed, Bobby Steinberg's voice was barely a whisper. Maybe I was wrong about your father." But Jake was staring at the medical bracelet, understanding finally dawning. The bears hadn't come to threaten or to claim territory. They'd come to return something precious to the man who'd spent his life protecting them. They'd come to say goodbye. The bears' departure left the funeral gathering in stunned silence, but their presence had somehow broken the dam holding back 15 years of Jake's suppressed grief. As the mourners slowly resumed the burial service, Jake found himself unable to focus on Pastor Mackenzie's words about eternal rest and divine mercy. Instead, he kept staring at the medical bracelet Moses had returned, its worn metal surface catching the gray afternoon light like a small beacon of impossible truth. Sarah delivered the eulogy with the steady voice of someone accustomed to speaking about life and death, but Jake heard only fragments. A man who saw potential where others saw problems, who believed every creature deserved a chance at healing, who taught us that love sometimes means making sacrifices others will never understand. The words felt hollow compared to the revelation that had been building in Jake's chest since reading his father's letter. As the first shovelful of Montana soil hit the pine casket, the sound seemed to echo the finality of all the conversations they'd never have, all the understanding that had come too late. After the last mourner had offered condolences and driven away, Jake found himself alone at the graveside with Sarah and Eleanor. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks and the promise of winter's approach. Soon, this place would be locked in ice and silence, but for now, it held only the weight of their collective grief. "I destroyed everything with him," Jake said finally, his voice barely audible above the wind. 15 years of hating him for something he never did. 15 years of believing the worst, when he was protecting me." Sarah touched his shoulder gently. "He never stopped hoping you'd come home, Jake. Every Christmas, every birthday, he'd set an extra place at the table just in case. But I didn't come home. I let pride and anger and my own guilt keep me away until it was too late." Jake's voice cracked with the weight of regret. "Do you know what the worst part is? I convinced myself I was the victim. Poor Jake, abandoned by his father for a bunch of wild animals. I built my whole adult identity around that resentment." Eleanor, who had been unusually quiet since the bear's visit, suddenly gripped Jake's arm with surprising strength. "Billy knew, honey. He knew you were hurting and angry, but he also knew why. He carried that accident like a stone in his chest for 15 years, wondering if he'd made the right choice." "What do you mean?" Eleanor's eyes, clouded by disease but sharp with memory, focused on something beyond the grave. "The night before he died, he called me, told me about the bear cub he'd saved, how holding her reminded him of you at that age. He said maybe he'd been wrong to keep the truth from you. Maybe honesty would have been kinder than protection." Jake felt his knees give out, sinking onto the cold ground beside his father's grave. The enormity of what had been lost hit him like a physical blow. Not just 15 years of relationship, but the knowledge that his father had spent those same years questioning his choices, carrying his own burden of guilt and doubt. "I was supposed to be the man of the family after Mom died," Jake whispered. "Instead, I ran away like a scared kid and left him to handle everything alone." "You were 23, Sarah said firmly. 23 and drunk and terrified. Making mistakes doesn't make you a coward, Jake. But letting those mistakes define you for the rest of your life, that's what Dad was trying to spare you from." Jake looked up at his sister, seeing her clearly for the first time in years. While he'd been nursing his resentment, she'd been quietly supporting their father, paying his bills, checking on his health, carrying her own burden of guilt about not visiting enough. "How do you stand it, knowing we failed him?" "Because I don't think we did fail him," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. "Look around you, Jake. Look at what happened here today. 3 wild bears came to honor him. A community came together to remember him. His work, his legacy, his love, it all continues even though he's gone." But Jake couldn't find comfort in legacy when his personal failure felt so complete. "I came back here to take his money, Sarah. Not to reconcile, not to make peace. I needed cash for my custody battle, and I thought the ranch would solve my problems. And instead? Instead, I discovered I was the problem. I've been so angry for so long, I forgot how to be anything else. My marriage failed because I couldn't trust anyone not to abandon me. I'm fighting for custody of a son I barely know how to father because I'm terrified of becoming the kind of man I thought my dad was, distant, cold, caring more about his work than his family." Eleanor's weathered hand found his cheek, turning his face toward hers. "Billy wasn't distant, honey. He was afraid. Afraid of saying the wrong thing. Afraid of making things worse. Afraid you'd hate him even more if you knew the truth. Some people love so hard they tie themselves in knots trying to protect the ones they care about." The words hit Jake like cold water, washing away the last of his carefully constructed resentment and leaving only raw grief in its place. He'd spent 15 years hating his father for being exactly what Jake feared becoming. A man so focused on doing right that he forgot how to simply be present. "I'm going to lose Tommy," Jake said, the admission torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "My ex-wife is right. I don't know how to be a father. I'm 38 years old and I still don't know how to love someone without driving them away." Sarah knelt beside him in the dirt, her expensive funeral dress forgotten. "Then learn. It's not too late for you and Tommy, Jake. But it starts with forgiving yourself for being human. Dad spent his whole life trying to fix broken things. Animals, relationships, people. Maybe it's time we stopped being broken and started being whole." As if summoned by her words, the wind carried a sound from the direction of the barn, a small, plaintive cry that reminded Jake of something important he'd forgotten in his grief. The bear cub. His father's last rescue was still recovering, still depending on human care to survive. "The cub," Jake said suddenly, struggling to his feet. "Dad's last patient. She'll die without care." Sarah and Eleanor exchanged glances. "Maybe," Eleanor said with the ghost of a smile. "That's where healing begins." The bear cub lay motionless in her makeshift recovery pen, her breathing so shallow that Jake's heart lurched with panic. 3 days without proper care had taken their toll. The surgical site showed signs of infection, and her small body felt fevered when he touched her gently. Sarah immediately shifted into medical mode, her surgical training adapting to veterinary needs as she examined the tiny patient. "She's dehydrated and running a fever," Sarah announced, her voice carrying the clinical detachment that had saved countless human lives. "The surgical site is infected, probably from inadequate post-operative care. We need antibiotics, IV fluids, and constant monitoring." "I can't afford a veterinary hospital," Jake said quietly, the reality of their situation hitting him like cold water. "Dad's insurance won't cover wildlife treatment, and the ranch is already drowning in debt." Eleanor, who had been watching the cub with unusual intensity, suddenly spoke up. "Billy's veterinary supplies are in the medicine cabinet. Everything he'd need for post-surgical care. He always kept extra because emergencies don't wait for business hours." Jake found himself looking at the cub through new eyes. Not as another burden, but as the last connection to his father's life work. "I don't know anything about veterinary medicine." "But I do," Sarah said, rolling up her sleeves. "Hearts are hearts, whether human or animal. The principles are the same: circulation, oxygenation, infection control. I can adapt." As Sarah worked to establish an IV line using equipment designed for much larger animals, Jake found his father's treatment journals in the barn office. Page after page of meticulous notes documenting every wildlife rescue over 4 decades. The handwriting was cramped but precise, each case study revealing not just medical details but emotional investment. "Listen to this," Jake read aloud. "Bear cub, approximately 16 weeks, severe malnutrition and abandonment trauma. Day 1, refused all food, showed signs of severe depression. Day 3, first acceptance of bottle feeding. Day 12, beginning to show normal cub behaviors, play, curiosity, social bonding. Note, this little one reminds me of Jake at age 4, stubborn but resilient." Sarah looked up from the IV insertion. "When was that entry?" Jake checked the date. 2 months after I left home. He was thinking about me even then." The journal entries became a revelation, each page showing how deeply their father had connected with every animal under his care. But more than that, they revealed his thoughts about his children woven throughout the medical observations. References to Jake's stubbornness when comparing difficult patients, mentions of Sarah's precision when describing successful procedures. Their father had carried them with him in his work, even when physical distance kept them apart. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a more recent entry. "Bear cub, female, snare injury to left hind leg. Reminds me of Moses 20 years ago, same fierce will to survive. This one has Jake's eyes when he's determined about something. Praying I live long enough to see her released back to the wild where she belongs." Jake's throat tightened as he realized this was about the cub they were now treating, his father's final patient, and perhaps his final attempt to bridge the gap between his wildlife work and his love for his children. Over the next 48 hours, they took shifts monitoring the cub's condition. Sarah's medical expertise proved invaluable, but it was Jake who seemed to have inherited their father's intuitive understanding of animal behavior. The cub responded to his voice, calming when he spoke in the same gentle tones Bill had used with frightened creatures. "She trusts you," Sarah observed during one of their late-night vigils. Just like the bears at the funeral trusted Dad's memory enough to come say goodbye. I keep thinking about what Eleanor said, about Dad being afraid instead of distant. What if I've been afraid too? Afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of caring too much, afraid of turning into him. Sarah set down her coffee and looked at her brother with the directness that had made her an excellent surgeon. And what if being like him wouldn't be the worst thing in the world? What if the problem wasn't that he cared too much, but that we didn't understand how his caring manifested? The conversation was interrupted by Eleanor's arrival at the barn, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing an expression of unusual clarity. Her Alzheimer's seemed to retreat during crises, allowing glimpses of the sharp-minded woman she'd once been. "How's our patient?" Eleanor asked, settling beside the recovery pen with surprising agility for her age. "Improving," Jake reported. "Temperature's down, and she took almost a full bottle this morning." Eleanor nodded approvingly, then fixed Jake with a stare that reminded him of childhood interrogations about broken windows and missing cookies. "Found something in Billy's papers you need to see." She handed him a manila folder labeled Jake for when he's ready. Inside, Jake discovered copies of every letter he'd written home during his first years away, angry, hurt letters full of accusations and demands for explanations. Below each letter was a draft of his father's reply, none of which had ever been sent. "He wrote back every time," Eleanor explained, "spent hours on each response, trying to find the right words. But he was so afraid of making things worse that he never sent them." Jake read through the unsent letters, each one revealing his father's anguish over their estrangement. The replies progressed from defensive justifications to heartbroken pleas for understanding to resigned acceptance of his son's anger. But throughout all of them ran a consistent thread: love, regret, and hope for eventual reconciliation. "The last one is from 6 months ago," Eleanor said quietly, "after he got his diagnosis." Jake's hands shook as he opened the final letter. "Son, the doctors tell me I don't have much time left, and I find myself thinking about all the conversations we never had. I made choices that seemed right at the time but drove you away, and I've regretted that every day for 15 years. I took responsibility for that accident because I couldn't bear to watch you carry that guilt, but maybe I was wrong. Maybe honesty would have been kinder than protection. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I forfeited that right when I let you leave, believing I chose animals over family. But I want you to know that every creature I saved carried a piece of my love for you. Every healing was an attempt to heal the break between us. Every life I preserved was my way of honoring the life you could have lived without that accident weighing you down. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and Eleanor thought you were ready for the truth. I hope someday you'll understand that everything I did, right or wrong, came from loving you more than I knew how to express. Take care of yourself, son. Take care of your boy. Break the cycle of silence that has haunted our family for too long. With all my love and regret. Dad, P.S. If anything happens to me, please check on the bear cub in the barn. She deserves a chance at the wild, just like you deserved a chance at freedom from guilt." Jake set the letter down with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his father's love and sacrifice. For 15 years, he'd carried anger like armor against the pain of abandonment, never realizing that his father had been carrying an even heavier burden, the weight of a choice that had saved his son's future at the cost of their relationship. "He never stopped hoping you'd come home," Eleanor said softly. Even when the diagnosis came, his first thought was bringing his children together before it was too late. Sarah moved to embrace her brother as he finally allowed himself to grieve, not just for their father's death, but for the 15 years of love they'd lost to misunderstanding and pride. In the recovery pen beside them, The bear cub stirred, opening dark eyes that did indeed remind Jake of his own reflection as a child, stubborn, resilient, and learning to trust again. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We heal," Sarah said simply. "The cub, ourselves, this family. We learn to love the way Dad did, completely, protectively, and without reservation." Jake looked around the barn where his father had performed miracles of healing for 4 decades, understanding finally that the greatest miracle might be the possibility of healing their fractured family. The bear cub would recover and return to the wild where she belonged. But Jake was beginning to think that maybe, just maybe, he belonged here too. 6 weeks after the funeral, the Henderson Ranch looked different, not just because of the early November snow dusting the peaks, but because of the changes that grief and revelation had wrought. Jake had taken indefinite leave from the Forest Service, using his savings and Sarah's financial help to catch up on the ranch's overdue bills. More importantly, he'd brought 8-year-old Tommy to spend Thanksgiving week at the ranch, hoping to begin healing the relationship with his son that his own anger had damaged. Tommy Henderson. Morrison stood barely 4 feet tall, with his grandfather's dark eyes and his father's stubborn chin. The divorce had been hard on him, and Jake could see wariness in the boy's posture as he explored the ranch. The careful distance of a child who'd learned not to trust too easily in adult promises. "Is that really where Grandpa lived?" Tommy asked, staring at the ranch house with the wide-eyed wonder of a city kid seeing open country for the first time. "This is where I grew up," Jake said, kneeling to his son's level. "Your grandpa built that tire swing on the oak tree when I was about your age. Why didn't we ever visit him?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow, its innocent directness cutting through all his careful explanations. How do you tell an 8-year-old that pride and misunderstanding had stolen years from both their lives? "Because I was angry about something that happened a long time ago, and I was wrong to be angry." Tommy processed this with the serious expression he'd inherited from both sides of the family. "Mom says being angry hurts you more than the person you're mad at. Your mom is very smart." Sarah emerged from the barn carrying the bear cub, who had grown noticeably larger and more active during her recovery. The little bear's leg had healed perfectly, though she still favored it slightly when walking. More importantly, she'd begun showing the natural wariness of humans that would serve her well when released back to the wild. "Tommy, I'd like you to meet someone special," Sarah said, settling cross-legged on the ground with practiced ease. "This is Luna. She's been staying with us while her leg healed." Tommy's eyes went wide as he took in the sight of a real bear cub, smaller than he'd expected but unmistakably wild. "Can I touch her?" "Very gently," Sarah instructed. "She's not a pet. She's a wild animal who's going back to her forest home soon. But your grandpa taught us that sometimes wild things need human help to survive." As Tommy carefully stroked Luna's thick fur, Jake felt a profound connection to his father's life work. This was what Bill Henderson had understood, that the line between human and animal worlds wasn't a barrier to be maintained, but a bridge to be crossed with respect and compassion. Eleanor arrived for Thanksgiving dinner carrying a covered dish and wearing her best dress, her Alzheimer's symptoms manageable enough for her to function independently most days. The disease had a cruel randomness. Some days she was sharp and present, others lost in confusion, but today was one of the good days. "Billy would have loved this," Eleanor said, watching Tommy help Sarah prepare Luna's evening bottle. 4 generations of his family together, carrying on his work. 4 generations? Jake asked. Sarah's face flushed slightly. "I was going to wait until after dinner to tell you, but I'm pregnant." The announcement hit Jake like sunrise after a long night. In the midst of loss and healing, new life was beginning. Sarah, that's when? June. The father is Dr. Michael Chen from the hospital. We've been seeing each other for 2 years. He wanted to come today, but I thought this should be just family first. Jake embraced his sister, feeling the weight of their father's dreams settling around them like a warm blanket. Bill had always hoped for grandchildren, for the ranch to echo with young voices again. He'd never lived to see Sarah's baby, but his legacy would continue in ways he'd never imagined. Dinner that evening felt like a bridge between past and future. They told Tommy stories about his grandfather, not the sanitized versions Jake had planned, but honest tales about a complicated man who'd loved deeply and made mistakes, and tried to do right by everyone, human and animal alike. "Grandpa sounds like he was brave," Tommy said, working on his second helping of Eleanor's famous stuffing. "He was," Jake agreed, "but he was also scared sometimes." "Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you do the right thing even when you are afraid." After dinner, they walked to Bill's grave, where someone had left fresh wildflowers despite the approaching winter. The headstone was simple granite with an inscription Sarah had chosen. William Henderson. He saw potential where others saw problems. "I want to tell you something about your grandpa," Jake said to Tommy, choosing his words carefully. "When I was young, I made a big mistake that hurt someone. Grandpa took the blame for what I did, even though it cost him a lot of trouble. I was angry about that for a long time because I didn't understand why he did it. Why did he? Because he loved me more than he cared about himself, and because he wanted me to have a good life without carrying guilt for my mistake." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, processing this adult complexity with the seriousness that divorce had forced on him too early. "Are you going to do that for me if I make mistakes?" Jake's throat tightened with emotion. "I'm going to try to be the kind of father who helps you learn from mistakes instead of hiding from them. But yes, Tommy, I'll always love you more than I care about myself." As they walked back toward the house, Luna's release date weighed on Jake's mind. Dr. Patricia Vance from the university had confirmed that the cub was healthy enough for reintroduction to the wild, but Jake found himself reluctant to let go of this last connection to his father's work. "She needs to go back to the forest," Sarah said, reading his thoughts with sibling intuition. "Dad always said the measure of successful wildlife rehabilitation was how quickly you could make yourself unnecessary." "I know. It's just, she's the last patient he saved. When she's gone, that part of his life is really over. Or maybe it's just beginning," Eleanor suggested. "You've got a gift with animals, Jake. Inherited it from your father. And this ranch has everything needed for wildlife rehabilitation. Might be that Billy's work isn't ending, just changing hands." The idea had been growing in Jake's mind for weeks, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel real and possible. "I'd need training, certification, permits, and help," Sarah added. "I could consult on the medical side, at least until the baby comes. Maybe afterwards, too. There's something to be said for raising a child around this kind of work." That night, as snow began falling outside the ranch house windows, Jake sat in his father's chair, reading through decades of treatment records. Each case study revealed not just medical procedures, but profound respect for the animals under Bill's care. Jake began to understand that his father's work hadn't been about imposing human will on wild creatures, but about giving them the tools to remain wild. Tommy fell asleep on the couch beside him, one small hand resting on a photo of Bill releasing a rehabilitated eagle. 4 generations of Henderson men, Jake thought. Bill, himself, Tommy, and Sarah's unborn child, who would grow up understanding that love meant service, that healing was possible, and that some bridges, once rebuilt, could span any distance. Outside, Luna slept peacefully in her recovery pen, dreams of forest freedom filling her wild mind. In 3 days, she would return to the mountains where she belonged. But the healing she represented, of bodies, relationships, and broken trust, would continue long after her paw prints faded from the ranch snow. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give our children isn't protection from pain, but the wisdom that comes after healing from it. Dr. Bill Henderson spent 15 years believing his son hated him, carrying the weight of a choice that saved Jake's future but cost them their relationship. How many of us have made similar sacrifices, taking blame, hiding truth, choosing our children's freedom over our own peace? Bill's story reminds us that love doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it looks like a father covering for his son's mistake. Sometimes it looks like a daughter secretly paying medical bills. Sometimes it looks like wild bears returning a lost bracelet to honor the man who saved their lives. In our golden years, we often carry regrets about words unspoken, chances missed, relationships strained by pride and misunderstanding. But Bill's legacy teaches us it's never too late for healing. Not for ourselves, not for our families, not even for the wild things we've learned to love. The Henderson Ranch became a place where broken hearts mended alongside broken wings, where 3 generations learned that forgiveness creates more miracles than resentment ever could. What family relationship in your life needs the healing that only forgiveness can bring? Have you ever sacrificed your own peace to protect someone you love? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what another heart needs to hear today.